Hello, everyone. Now we will continue here in the front of this old bus. I'm Dávid Vitézy. I'm the General Director of the Hungarian Museum of Transport. And today my task is here to talk a little about the future of transportation and how what we think about transportation is changing and evolving in the 21st century. The first article was published in Hungary in 1905, 114 years ago, that horse meat became quite popular and it's possible to buy and eat it in Budapest. Have you ever tried horse meat? I didn't. No one? You did. You know why horse meat became popular at that days? Because the horse was starting to disappear as a mass mobility solution. Carts and omnibuses, which were carried by horses, were starting to disappear. Engine-based solutions, buses, the electric tram, first of all, and then a little later on, cars started to appear and serve transportation needs of citizens all around the cities in the world, not just in Budapest. And that replaced horses. And we kept horses in our societies. We still ride on them sometimes, but not on the public streets, but on private circuits. The question is, will this happen to the automobile as well? I mean, we won't eat automobiles for sure. But if we ask ourselves in 20 or 30 years from now, or maybe even 50, what happened to the cars, what happened to the culture, which we know very well in our current lives, that many people, not all of them, not all of us, but many people are attached to their cars. Somehow they see their cars as an extension of their own private space. They keep their gym bag in it, they drive around to every kind of different destinations in their cars. So this kind of personal usage of one metal box, which is attached to our lives, will this stay with us? I think this is a very interesting question. In the late 1930s, if I could start, I mean, I'm museum director after all, so if I can start from the history a little bit. From the late 1930s, the car companies, the major car companies of the world in the United States started to advertise the cars not just as objects, not just as a day-to-day object, a new way of mobility, but a new lifestyle. In the United States, where this kind of logic has started in 1939 in the New York World Fair, General Motors exhibited a new vision of urban life, where everything was designed around cars. There were skyscrapers, there were very wide roads with 10 lanes and cars all over, and the whole city was sized, was designed around cars. At that moment in history, there was no city in the world which looked like that. It was a very utopian vision. It's something, if you see currently, I don't know, flying or self-driving cars taking over all the place, and you see all these drawings and visions. It was so utopian at that time to see a city designed totally around cars. But it doesn't happen all the time that these technological utopist visions turn to be true all around the world, but this was what happened with cars. In the next decades, first the United States and then all major cities, mostly all around the world, started to redesign their cities around cars. How we perceive a public space, how we perceive the distance between two houses in a new developed area, how we design a new house became extremely car-centric. Now we are sitting in a small public space here, but behind us most of the public space, most of our public roads are centered and designed around cars. If someone wants to build a new house somewhere in an empty lot, here in Budapest and in most of the cities of the world, they are required to build parking under it, even if there wasn't parking before there. So we started a new school in the late 1930s, early 1940s, to design our cities around cars. And major questions were not, maybe not asked and certainly not answered. Most of the trips in our cities are shorter than 15 kilometers, the majority of them. Most of the emissions which we have to see in our cities coming out from cars and coming out from the environmental damages caused by traffic are coming from these short trips all around in our cities. And this is absorbing most of the public space. But still, we use a huge metal box which is designed to be used for very far distances, which is designed to be safe enough to be driven by 130 km/h on a freeway. We use these metal boxes even for a very short trip of 1 or 2 kilometers of length in a city from here to the other side of the Danube by many, many people. And this is what's being encouraged by the design. When this whole exhibition was held in 1939 in New York, and it was a huge success, people loved this future. They loved that they will be able to use their cars to drive from home to work and avoid very crowded streetcars and trams of the time, to avoid very crowded buses, to avoid walking, to avoid cycling. So not all of the people, but many people saw this as a huge opportunity, and then the movement to design cities around cars has started. In most of the cities in the US, streetcar systems were demolished in the 1950s. Most of the downtown areas were cut through by freeways. In Europe, this happened a little later. After the Second World War, much of the central downtown areas of European cities were destroyed, but not all of it. So still the fabric, the city which wasn't designed for automobiles but for people, and the sizes related to that were kept in most of the downtown areas of European cities. This certainly applies to Budapest, where there were very, very severe damages all around the city, but still, if I look around where I'm standing now, most of the buildings are pre-war, and most of the urban fabric, at least in the downtown area here in Budapest, was designed before the automobile. But what we did in this European setting is we tried to use all of our public spaces, all of the public spaces which were there between the houses, between this urban fabric, to accommodate car traffic. Most of the public plazas like this where we are were used to park cars, to put surface parking, or to provide new lanes for traffic to get through. If you just think about how Budapest looked like 20 years ago, it was still different than now. Just one of the small streets which are passing through the city center were catering huge traffic, which is now a pedestrian street. Even in Vörösmarty Square, which is the central pedestrian square of Budapest, there were a lot of cars parked just a little more than 20 years ago. Slowly, many cities around the world started to recognize that keeping all of our public spaces for cars is not a sustainable solution, and a new movement started to change this back a little bit. In some cities, for example, which many people know, I think many of you know, in Amsterdam, in Copenhagen, this process was a lot quicker. It wasn't like how we see currently these cities, Copenhagen or Amsterdam. It wasn't like that 40 years ago. All the public spaces of those cities were filled with cars as well. They took very brave and very efficient and very thoroughly delivered policy decisions to take back public spaces from cars. And they delivered this, and they are very successful with it. As we know, most of the trips taken in these cities I mentioned are taken by bike and public transportation, and it's a lot more livable and a lot more sustainable than the cities which remain to be car-centric. So the question is, I think, how technology will change this. Because this is what we already know, this is what we see. There is a tension between the car-centric design, which is still followed by most of the engineers who are planning the cities. This is an ongoing debate. Should we build more parking or should we build less parking? Because then there will be less traffic. If there is a traffic jam, should we build more roads, or to the contrary, more roads will attract more traffic and will just create newer problems with following the same old ways of designing the cities. I believe that all the ways how we decide about our public spaces, all the ways how we decide about our public policies, they will have an impact on our cities. You should design the city which you want to see. So if you design it for cars, you will get a lot of cars. If you design a city which accommodates cycling, and there is a safe way to use your bicycles around it, there more people will be who are cycling. If there is a good public transportation and a cheap, reliable service, then more people will use it. This sounds very obvious, but still, we see that in many cities you have those strategies which say that, oh, we need a lot less cars, we need more sustainable transportation, whatever, and they still provide free parking for everyone in public spaces. So sometimes the day-to-day decisions and the long-term policy is clashing very clearly. So what are the new technologies which are trying to change this? On one hand, what we see is micromobility rising in a way how no one, I think, thought that it will. I'm not sure many of you are familiar with the term, but if I say that electric scooters, shared bikes, dockless electric bikes, I think that sounds more familiar. Generally, what professionals these days try to call micromobility is actually those kind of electric devices which are lighter than 500 kilograms, so much lighter than a car, and you can rent them and you can leave them in another location. You don't have to dock it in a station or whatever, you can just leave it supposedly not anywhere, not in blocking the sidewalk, but still mostly anywhere in the city, and you pay by the app and you rent it by the app. We see these solutions popping up in all cities all around the world in different brands and different ways. There are electric bikes, there are dockless traditional bikes, we see scooters, we see mopeds, we see tricycles, we see all these small devices which are provided to people to use them. And I think this is somehow an even more important innovation and an even more important change that how people were thinking about it just 2 years ago. Not much more, just 2 years ago. A few years ago, what we heard is that self-driving cars or driverless cars are coming, they will take over all our streets and they will solve all our problems. And that will be the technology innovation, what we will see in the early 21st century. Instead, what happened is a new technology arrived, which was already here, bikes and scooters. But what was the innovation in it is that you can use a device which is not your own, you can rent it, and you can use another device when you need it. So there is a car which you can rent and leave at another location when you need a car, but otherwise you can use a scooter or a bike. And I think this is very important because most of the trips taken in the city, as I mentioned already, are shorter than 10 kilometers. And for these distances, these kind of devices are perfect. If you just want to go to a few kilometers, and most of the destinations in, for example, in downtown Budapest are that far away, mostly an electric bike or an electric moped or scooter is sufficient enough. It's even sometimes, or I would say mostly, it's even quicker than using any other mode because the distances are short. The problem is mostly that there is a lack of sufficient infrastructure to use these vehicles, and sometimes you feel a bit unsafe because dedicated infrastructure. What we see that these kind of services are gaining market share faster than Uber did when Uber appeared a few years ago. I think many of you remember when these new ride-sharing solutions appeared. Not just Uber is there, but there are other players in other markets all around the world, in the Middle East or China. But when these ride-sharing apps appeared in our app stores, in 1 year time, they've taken over a significant part of the taxi industry in many major cities. And they gained a lot of new market share. A lot of new people started to share rides and use cars than who did before. So what we see with micromobility, what we see with these shared electric bikes and scooters, that they are gaining more saturation, they are gaining more market share more quickly than how, for example, Uber did. So they are just 1 or 2 years old services. We don't see them in all around of all cities, but I expect that in a very short period of time, they will gain a lot of new attention, thousands and thousands and thousands of new scooters, e-bikes, mopeds will pop up under different brand names all around our cities, will be used by thousands and thousands of people. And the question will be raised how we allocate public space to these solutions, how we do this. Before this whole movement, this whole revolution of micromobility, what happened is that there were bike lanes, not perfect ones in most cities, including Budapest, but there were some. And there was and there is a bike movement for more bike lanes, more safe biking infrastructure. In Budapest, for example, there is a very strong cyclist movement. The Hungarian Cyclist Club, they are pushing very hard to get better infrastructure. They are quite successful. They are one of the best organized organization for this kind of, or in its kind, globally, I would say. But still, people who were using their bikes day to day were pushing, organizing for better bike lanes. What is changing now that a lot of new people need these lanes. Most people who are using these electric scooters, these shared electric bikes, are not the same people who were using their bikes before. They are shifting from using their car, using taxi-like services, ride-sharing, or using public transportation in certain cases. So a new demand is created for bike lanes, because if you want to use your e-scooter or if you want to use your e-bike, you won't feel safe if you want to mix on the pavement with pedestrians, and it's not safe for them either, so we shouldn't allow that. But it's not even safe to mix these small devices, human-sized devices, with cars. In car traffic, you won't feel safe, you don't feel safe on a small scooter. So the demand for bike lanes is growing. And we shouldn't just think about bike lanes as before. We should start thinking about reallocating our public spaces to these new devices, these new short-term electric shared devices like a scooter or an e-bike in the future when we are thinking about our roads. And this is a lot more sustainable. These are electric small devices, environmentally sustainable, and a lot more logical than using your own car. Why would you use a huge metal box, a car, just to get 2 kilometers to get on a trip of 2 kilometers in a central city? It doesn't make any sense. You do it, but we do it because for decades and decades we started to design our cities around cars, but it's not a logical thing to do. So if you buy a car, you feel that you paid a lot of money, you want to use it as much as you can, you want to use it for all kinds of trips and purposes. A car sometimes is the best solution. No one questions that. If you want to get from here to another region of Hungary, to a small village, if you have to carry your whole family with you somewhere, if you go from one of the outskirts of Budapest to another outskirts of the city to get to an office park or a retail park somewhere out from the city. So there are a lot of trips where it makes sense to use your car. But most of the trips in a city, this is not true. And if we shift away from using the same solution for every kind of trip, and there will be solutions for people to use another solutions like micromobility, this will change. But still, public transportation will carry most of the people in a sustainable way in our cities. We shouldn't forget that. And public transportation is being threatened these days. And I think we have to talk about it now in the early 21st century, because it's not a global trend yet, but the threat, I think, is very real. What we saw in the 1950s, 1960s, was a movement, a global movement against public transportation. People were claiming that there is no more need for improving public transportation, there is no more need to sustain our streetcar, light rail, tram systems all around the world, because the car is here and the car will take over and the car will solve everything. We now know that it's not true, but this was the claim. And this is how many major American cities, I would say most of them, dismantled and demolished their tram systems, streetcar systems, and many European cities did so. Budapest was very lucky to keep its tram system, for example. We still have the highest ridership tram network in the world in Budapest. But most of the European cities started to give more and more and more public spaces to cars in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Luckily, all around the world now, I think most of the cities realize that without public transportation, a city is not sustainable. If you want to check if what I just said is true, we should have a look on the example of Los Angeles. That city, I think, invested the most all around the world to provide as much public space for cars as possible. more than 50% of all public spaces, more than 50% of the whole size of the city is used by cars, either parked or either moving. All the public spaces were delegated to provide space for more and more cars, and more than 90% of all movements in the city are by car currently, which is one of the worst statistics all around the world. Just to compare it, in Budapest, the city of 1.7 million people, 58% of all movements are made by public transportation currently. So public transportation was practically disappearing from Los Angeles until a few years ago, and they tried to outbuild themselves from congestion by building more and more highways, more and more roads, but more and more roads just created more and more traffic. Just recently it happened again. And finally, even in a city where a huge majority, 90% majority of people are using their cars, on a public vote, people voted for better public transportation and even a tax raise to build competitive public transportation and the metro system all around LA. So I think the test bed of car-centric urban design and the city designed around cars was there. Many other cities tried this, but maybe not to that extreme as LA did and tried. So if we can say that in the 20th century there was a clear movement against public transportation in many cities, but mostly, in most cases, public transportation survived it. And now there is a renaissance of public transportation in many cities. If you look around, not just in LA, but in Paris, in London, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in all of the Chinese cities, in Moscow, huge investment plans are in place for building more and more rail, more and more metro systems, streetcars. Many Western European cities who canceled their whole tram operations after the war, now they are rebuilding, maybe on different routes and different locations, but they are rebuilding their tram systems, electric tram systems in their cities. In France, more than 2,000 cities did that in the last 20 years. So why public transportation is under threat? Because what we see is that with new technologies rising, public transportation is being questioned again. For example, we see, I don't want to say that it's the most important movement of all, but it's a very important sign that we should take attention, we should take care. What we see from Elon Musk, for example, is that he says that public transportation is not competitive, and he wants to replace public transportation projects and rail investments by cars in tunnels. They started a new company for boring tunnels, and they say that if they put their Tesla cars into tunnels, that will solve everything. And they claim that it can replace a subway or a rail investment in major cities. If you look at the numbers, we can easily find out that this is not true. I would easily call it a scam. If you want to compare, if you see, I don't know if you've seen these tests of these solutions, what we see is that they put a regular passenger Tesla car in a tunnel and is driving in the tunnel. They just published a video a few days ago where they want to show that the same car in the traffic, being in the congested urban areas, is a lot slower than driving easily without any traffic in a tunnel. Yes, what's new about that? Tunneling technology is present in our cities for many, many decades. Actually, the first underground railway was opened in this European continent in Budapest in 1896. But this tunnel boring technology is with us for many, many decades, for more than 50 years just here in the city. And the case that private right-of-way, so if you have a right-of-way for a transportation solution, which has an exclusive lane, it's faster than anything else mixed in traffic, that's nothing new either. Anyone who ever traveled in a tram system, which has a right-of-way out of traffic, most tram lines here in Budapest has that, or have that, or if you traveled on a bus lane, yeah, that's a right-of-way. So the question is, why put private cars in a very expensive right-of-way in a tunnel, which you have to build, which is a lot of investment? Why put their private cars? If you compare, in Metro Line 3 here in this city, in Budapest, it can provide capacity for 28,000 people per hour per direction. There is a train every 150 seconds. If you compare this, you would have to carry 3 Tesla private cars full of people in every 2 seconds, altogether 94 cars in 1 minute to provide this capacity. Is it possible? No. How can you fit that many people into cars? I mean, imagine 4 people getting into a car, how much time it takes. And you know, sometimes people try to measure this by the capacity of the moving vehicles. But what happens at the end of the tunnel? How and where 3 cars in every 2 seconds are joining into the traffic of the city? How it doesn't get congested? When you look at the urban road tunnels which were built in some cities in the last 50, 60 years, Brussels is a good example. They poured a lot of road tunnels in their cities. What happens is that it's still congested, mostly not because of the capacity, lack of capacity of the tunnel itself, but the lack of the capacity of the junction where you enter or you leave the tunnel, because somewhere you have to get out of the tunnel and join the traffic of the city. So if you want to keep urban density, if you want to keep a city where a lot of people are moving around, a lot of people are studying, working, meeting each other, going to school, so if we want to use our cities how we use and how we like them to use in a dense way, it's impossible to serve these needs if you put 1 or even 4 people in metal boxes, car-like metal boxes, and you try to carry them around. The subway and even an articulated bus or a tram will be a lot more efficient. So I think we have to take attention to this Musk example, not because it's such an important scam. He tries this, he will sell this to a few cities, eventually it will fail. I think it will fail even before it gets built in many cities, and we already see this happening. I think it's not important because ridiculing Musk is that important in itself. I think it's important because it's the start of a new movement where they want to try to sell the public and the cities that driverless cars, or keeping this car culture, keeping this car-driven urban design culture, will eventually solve congestion. So the claim will be that from the 1940s, cars haven't really solved urban mobility because cities got congested and people started to realize that this won't work. We cannot replace all trips by car trips, and we still need public transportation. We still need bike lanes. I think most people understand this now, but the claim will be that the final solution is coming. So with driverless cars, with new car tunnels, we can eventually solve everything and replace public transportation. We not just see this from Musk. We see in important newspapers that, for example, in New York, it's being questioned now that should we invest in repairing the New York subway, which is not in a very good state of repair, or should we just rip out the tracks of the subway system and put asphalt in it and let cars in? This is seriously being questioned by quite serious newspapers these days. So the notion that technology will somehow solve congestion is being sold, and it's not directly threatening public transportation systems yet, but we should pay attention to this. There are very, very serious modelings of how self-driving cars will change our cities. In a scenario, which is still very far away, but in a scenario where all cars are replaced by self-driving cars, where there is no driver and the car is not owned by anyone, all of the cars are operating like taxis, so we hop into one, share taxis, we hop into one, there is someone already there who we don't know, we are traveling in quite the same direction, and then after we arrive to our destination and we want to travel again, we will call another car, not the same one, so we don't own one. If we imagine this scenario, there was a modeling made by researchers how this would operate, and what they found out that even if we get there, even if it happens that driverless technology will be so advanced that this is possible, this would cause even more traffic than what currently is there. A lot less cars would be needed because cars would be shared, but 9% more traffic would appear on the streets because many trips which trips are now taken by walking or cycling or by public transportation would shift to use these shared cars. So even more traffic could be on our streets than currently, according to these modelings. What's a very important benefit if this ever happens is that a lot of parking won't be needed, because parking, what essentially is that car culture resulted in a culture where we, as I said, we are somehow attached to our metal boxes, and we are used to that. If we get to anywhere, we try to store our metal boxes somewhere close to use them again when we are leaving that location. This is essentially what parking is, right? So parking will disappear if we start to share cars more and more, and this is why I believe that building more and more parking, especially from public funds, is not a good idea, not just in the future, but not even now. So this means that waiting for a solution that cars will solve congestion in a new era with a lot of new technology, we don't see from modelings that that will happen. What else we see is that certainly driverless technology, if it arrives, if you can trust that cars or buses will be able to drive themselves, we see a lot of tests happening all around the world. That technology will be very useful and very important in our societies. I don't want to say that I'm anti-innovation or that we don't have to pay attention to these new technologies. But what we see from these modelings is that if we try to regulate traffic in our cities, if we try to claim back as much public space from cars as possible, and if we say that in a suburban region or even just a regular residential area of a city, these shared taxis are taking you to the next metro station or the next tram station, and then you switch to a high-frequency public transportation corridor, then according to the modelings, 40% of all car traffic can disappear from our cities. That's a very high number, 40%. So it means that where density is in our central cities, where public transportation is irreplaceable, where buses, trams, metros, and all other public transportation modes are irreplaceable because public space is scarce, and we cannot replace these trips by metal boxes sitting 3 or 4 people in them. So if this is the case, then we might use the shared taxi, shared driverless car solution to feed these public transport solutions in low-density areas like residential, suburban areas, and concentrate our efforts to use public transportation and, as I said, light modes, micro-mobility, bikes, scooters, whatever, in our downtown areas. This is a vision which actually works, which does not create more congestion in our cities. So I think we really have to think about it, because when people people receive these new technologies and day-to-day usage of them starts, everything starts to be political. As I said, everyone knows that providing free parking in our downtown areas is not sustainable, and it goes right against all of the transportation strategies of our cities. But still, in most cities, free parking is provided for most of the residents of the cities. For the whole area, the whole district, it somehow differs, but still, that's the policy taken by many cities all around the world, including Budapest as well. It goes against all the environmental and transport policy goals of these cities. But we are doing it because politically it's impossible to take that right away. If this happens with cheap shared taxis, as it's happening with Uber and these services already, drivers in them all around the United States, it will be very hard to take these cheap services away, even in the case if it's congesting our cities. So I think before this driverless technology is arriving, we have to make clear that according all our experience with how car culture tried to change our cities and how all the public spaces were taken, and according to the scientific research which was put into this area, we shouldn't allow public transport to disappear. We shouldn't allow all these new technologies to claim that they can take over, and even today we shouldn't invest anymore into public transportation, because this claim is being made. We already see some articles, as I said, for example, the New York subway example. We already see examples where these companies or some other movements are claiming that we, now in 2019, we shouldn't invest in subways, we shouldn't invest in a tram system, we shouldn't invest in public transportation, because driverless cars will solve everything in a few years' time. That's not true. That's not true according to experience, and that's not true according to all the scientific modelings which were made. So I think this is my most important message today, that we should care about public transportation, we should keep it, we should invest in it, we should improve it, and what's very important, we should use all these new technologies, driverless technologies in them. What's more effective than a normal bus running like on line 7 here, or line 8? What's more efficient than if that bus becomes driverless? If we can trust the bus that it will drive itself, it will reduce the cost of that operation of that bus significantly, so the bus can be even more frequent. Mostly waiting for the bus is the most annoying part and the most incompetitive part of using the bus. So if frequencies can be lower, operational costs can come down, we can still use these high-capacity solutions which are irreplaceable with private trips to provide better public transportation. I think that's the right way of using driverless technology in our downtown areas, and not using this driverless technology to claim at the same time that designing cities around cars will eventually work, this time 80 years after the last failed and global attempt, which we've seen after the horses disappeared. So that's all. And please let me know if you have any questions or any comments on that. We have still 5 minutes for that.
Hello, my name is Carlos. I'm living in Norway, which is a place of a lot of shared transportation. And I very much enjoyed your talk, but what was very interesting for me to hear was that you mentioned this modernist agenda for car city. So for me what was interesting is that from point of view of architecture, modernists imagined that the car is going to be very much different than the horse. They imagined totally different transportation, different needs and so on. But actually it was not. The thing is, you still needed parking, you still needed gas, it was still private, and so on. And so I totally agree with you that actually the more radical and fundamental change has been the kind of society change, the idea of sharing. And that is much more a fundamental shift than from a horse to a car, in my opinion. But I really enjoyed your starting question. Your statement that you were eating horses a lot because they died. So my question would be, so what are we going to do with the cars? Because obviously they're going to die.
I think these are very important questions. One, I think what we will do with our current cars, that's one question, but I mean, we are throwing away cars in huge numbers already every day, so the same will happen with them. The question is, what will happen with the car industry? If current car trips are replaced by shared driverless cars, 10% of the current car fleet is needed. So from all cars which you see around here, 9 will be not needed. So that means that the car industry, which is one of the most important industries in many economies, many developed economies all around the world, including mostly the economy of the European Union and especially Germany, but Hungary as well. The way what we know about the car industry will essentially change, and somehow part of that will disappear. So that will be a very important change in the global economics and how countries and regions all around the world are competing against each other. And if you consider the oil industry and all of that which is attached to the car culture, that will be a huge change in the global economy, not just in the case how we use our actual cars. And I agree totally with you. Modernism was behind this whole movement of car-based urban design. What we saw, the name is Futurama of the General Motors exhibition in 1939 in the New York exhibition, World Fair. And what was there is not just the car-centric design, but from the architecture point of view, it was a modernist city which was designed there. So I think what is a very interesting question here, that currently the car-oriented public policy, the car-oriented urban policy is considered to be conservative. Mostly conservative parties, conservative movements, right-wing movements are pushing more hardly. I mean, it's not true for all countries, but generally for the United States it's true for sure. But in many countries the case is that the more conservative movements are pushing for car-centric policies, keeping more public space for cars, not redesigning your city towards a more sustainable way. But the truth is, being less car-centric is the conservative approach. Going back before modernism in terms of urban policy and how cities were a lot more sustainable than now is actually changing back your policies to a less car-centric or not car-centric at all approach. If you look at how most of the transportation policies look like for 2030. Oslo, for example. Oslo is removing all parking spaces from the central city, which is a very good example. But Budapest as well. In all these strategies, what you see is that most of the public spaces and most of the trips should shift from car use to public transport, walking and cycling. And how they imagine some of the downtown areas is actually the same how they were 100 years ago. Even sometimes if you look at pictures from 100 years ago, we see that there's something which is our current ambition, that, oh, how livable that was without cars. You had that experience, I guess, when there are all these Facebook pages where you see these old pictures from your own city, and you see a picture from 70 years ago and say, oh, how better it looks than now. So I think that, maybe not in all cases, but in many cases that's true. For Budapest, it's certainly true. So I think that, and I'm not talking generally about architecture, I'm talking about the policies, how we use our public spaces, how we allocate our public spaces. I think, somehow it's a progressive approach from the current way of thinking, but more generally, more overarching our current debate, I think it's somehow should be the conservative approach to get back the majority of public spaces from cars. And I think this should be discussed more and more in urban design, architecture, and transportation policy. I hope I answered your question. Please. We have a second microphone.
Hello. Yes. So this relates to this last answer. You say that the new cities, the design of the new cities looks pretty much how it was 100 years ago. But 100 years ago, those cities looked like that for historical reasons, right? That was an organic development of these urban locations. From design thinking point of view, what do you think leads to that kind of a design? You say that was a modernist approach, was the car-centric design. The current design thinking, the human-centric design looks at the individuals, as a center of the design thinking. What is the next paradigm that leads to this kind of livable? What do you think? What's the next design paradigm that leads to the same type of designs that was 100 years ago, that was organic, not?
Yes. I think human-centric design is not the same that designing for individuals. I think there is a difference there. Because I think that what I try to talk about today is designing for the benefit of the society, the urban society, and not just for certain needs. Jared Walker uses a very good term, elite projection, saying that sometimes people who are wealthier or somehow in the wealthier, more influential part of the society think that what's good for them is actually good for the society. We know this very well. Politicians talking about cars and public transportation from their own personal point of view, thinking that because you see more cars than trams, are actually more people using cars than trams, and the truth is not that more people are using public transportation in this very city than how many are sitting in cars, but you see more cars. Sometimes decision makers are using cars, so they think from their own point of view, if there would have been more parking or more lanes, the city would be better. I think this kind of elite projection is what we see from Musk when he says that he was in a congestion and traffic jam in LA and why we shouldn't build more lanes in tunnels. And I think the whole car-centric design comes from that. It's good for the people who can afford it until they get into congestion, because then I think they will spend half of their lives there. But it's unsustainable for the whole society. We need public transportation, because otherwise this city of 1.7 million people wouldn't operate, not even larger ones. So I think that human-centric design is society-focused and not individual-focused. And I think in mobility, in transportation decisions, it's very important that we should focus on the society and not individual needs, because I'm sure that there are individual claims which are right on their own, but you couldn't cater them in a city because there is not enough public space to cater everyone's needs with cars, for example. I mean, I know many people who claim that they have some special needs why they need to drive their cars into the very center of Budapest. And, I mean, maybe from their point of view, with their daily struggles and lives, there are some truths to that. But still, you can't cater that because you don't have enough public space in a historical city. So I think human-centric design is very important, and it should be society-based, and it should look in the overall sustainability, and not just environmental sustainability, but overall sustainability of the city. And I think what's very important as well, that with this whole shared mobility approach, with all the new technology which we have already in our pockets with our smartphones, we are able to provide human-sized mobility as well. Using all these e-bikes, scooters, whatever, these are human-sized devices. With all this sharing technology, we don't need to use our metal boxes, which are designed for 4 or 5 people and long touring trips to on freeways for 300 or 400 kilometers, cars essentially. We don't have to use them for short trips. This is provided by new technology and shared technology, and this is, in my understanding, this is a part of a human-centric design. So if there is nothing else, thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy Brain Bar.